Well, let me go right to the Dr. Carafano, the 5 areas that you've identified where there could be savings responsibly. Could you give us a couple of sentences at least on each of those areas, things that we should be looking at as a committee?
Yes, sir. We were disappointed with the administration's proposals for adjustments in TRICARE in this budget because essentially what we're getting is marginal adjustments that are really all pain and no gain. And there's really nothing in it for the service member. And so we would argue that what we really need here is substantial reforms that move from a defined benefit system to a defined contribution system. And reforms particularly that would make service members' benefits, particularly in healthcare and retirement, portable. We call this kind of the rucksack approach, that somebody ought to be able to move from the National Guard to the reserves to the active duty. And the one thing they should never have to worry about is what's going to happen to their health care, what's going to happen to their retirement benefits. I think that's important, not just for the potential savings in the growth of manpower costs, but I think continuum and continuity of service is going to be the single most robust thing we could do in order to increase recruiting and retention. We have a very mobile workforce. We have people staying longer, getting older. People should be able to serve when they want to at their convenience and not have to make difficult economic choices in order to volunteer for military service. So rather than the past, we kind of incentivized active because we wanted people to stay for 20 years, and we didn't want to encourage them to leave and go into the reserves or the National Guard or take a time out in their career. Now I think we want to facilitate that because I think we have enough people in this country that have the propensity to want to volunteer, and if we make it easy for them to serve, they will come and be there for us when we need them. And I think we're going to deliver not just reforms that save DOD money, but we're going to deliver the service members the kind of benefits that they think that they're used to and they're appropriate for and they feel comfortable with in a 21st century workforce. On the removing extraneous items, we have a list of what we did in last year's budget. We think it's instructive. You know, for example, that the Army R&D budget is 50% that is earmarked. The Army doesn't decide what it does on 50% of its research plan. Somebody else does. I think that's probably not right. On the efficiencies, I think you did hit the nail on the head. I think we've grown DoD staff far too much. We took the concept of jointness, which was an operational concept, and we tried to make it an administrative concept. And the notion of having more jointness driven administratively as opposed to building joint operational capability is, I think, incorrect. I think we went too far. I think we can divest in DoD staff and in terms of both operational and developmental capabilities, divest many things back to the services. Logistics-based performance is really a kind of a two-part exercise. One is—
Can you take a minute and explain to us? I was very intrigued by your reference there. Could you help us understand what your vision is there?
On the defense staff?
On the logistic base.
Yes, sir. So logistics-based performance is really is a kind of a two-part exercise. The first part is, again, following best practice from industry, shifting to metrics that actually measure valuable deliverables. So the important metric is, does the service person in the field get what they need when they need it to get the job done? It's not gross terms of how much stuff I moved from A to B. That adopting those kind of metrics has helped companies like FedEx become incredibly efficient in how they do business. The second part of that is looking at partnerships between the depots and the private sector industry in managing and participating in dealing with life cycle costs. So Letterkenny is a very good case study where they have partnered with industry early on and where they together manage life cycle costs and have gained significant efficiencies. Then the last area, again, is auditing. I'm not an auditing expert, but I do know this. If you audit bad, you get to a bad place very quickly. So you can impose all kinds of auditing things, but if you audit like Enron, you're going to get to a bad place. So rather than have a mantra and drumbeat that says, let's audit, let's audit, let's audit, let's audit correctly in a way that enhances efficiencies and doesn't detract from them. And again, we think a strategy that's based more on private sector best practices will get us there. But, you know, I do have to footnote all of this. We think that procurement in the military, buying the capabilities we need, which directly then impacts on readiness. So an aircraft, for example, where 80% of the cost of an aircraft is in the life cycle cost of the aircraft, modernization and readiness are kind of twin pillars. We think that we've been underfunding that for about $50 billion a year for well over a decade. And we all know that the large proponency of the increase in the costs in the last decade have gone for operations in Iraq and Afghanistan as elsewhere. We've under-recapitalized our force, and that butcher's bill is growing. And if all we do is look at current costs and we don't look at the neglect of the past, we don't really truly understand the cost of maintaining adequate capability. So we would like to find significant savings. We would like to plow those back into really getting the modernization accounts back where they need to be. This administration, this budget is a 17% cut in procurement, which is dramatic considering the under-procurement that we've done for well over a decade.
You know, I find myself agreeing with you in part and disagreeing in part, because when I see $46 billion spent on systems that never were deployed, that's a big waste of money.
All right, sir. And let's remember, part of that's because we canceled them.
Let me just, well, we canceled them for a reason.
Canceled them because the government didn't want to fund them.
Please, when you're the chairman, you actually get a chance to make your statement without being interrupted by the witness. So, look, we can't afford to spend money on things that we ultimately decide aren't valuable to deploy. With respect to audit, you can't manage unless you can audit. You know, I have a business background. I don't know of any business that can manage without being able to audit. Dr. O'Hanlon, I'd like to go to you. You've given us 6 distinct areas where you think savings could be achieved. Do you have any idea how much could be saved in those 6 areas? What dollar amounts?
Thanks, Senator. Yes, I have ballpark estimates for each. For the ground forces, once phased in, this would be about a $10 billion a year savings. Now, it would take time to phase that in, and these are above and beyond the reductions that are already planned. So over a 10-year period, even if we did this and made the Army and Marine Corps slightly smaller than in the 1990s, and obviously there's some debate on the panel about whether that would be advisable, but I think at this point in history it could be. Nonetheless, the savings are probably going to be $50 to $60 billion over 10 years. On the same kind of thing with the Navy concept of CSWAP, I think the potential savings here are at least $5 billion a year. But again, it's going to take the Navy some time to get to this concept. They're going to have to work out where they can do overseas maintenance of the ships a little bit more than they do right now, for example. So I might anticipate $40 billion in 10-year savings in a ballpark sense. With the F-35 and the littoral combat ship, for example, it depends, of course, whether you try to make the savings quickly and just slow down the rate of production and have it be a slower pace over a longer period of time, or once the F-35, for example, is up and running and looking good, do you just go ahead and buy all 12 or 13 or 1,400 planes and then be done with it? If you do the latter, you don't save any money in the 10 years. But it's probably better business practice in many ways because it drives down your unit cost and improves your chances of having the export markets stay in good shape. So when I put all this together, and I also acknowledge that, again, the administration may not yet have generated enough program cuts to satisfy the $487 billion requirement, I think when I add it all up, I'm in the range of $100 billion in additional budget savings over a 10-year period.
Mm-hmm. Let me just say that one place Dr. Carafano mentioned that I have seen for some time is replacing our legacy systems. It's real hard to see how we do that with the budgets that we have going forward. You know, if we look at our tanker, if we look at our bomber, if we look at our major ships, you know, the time for recapitalizing is unfortunately coming all at once. And my own belief has been we're going to have a different way of financing the acquisition of major systems. And we're going to have to spread cost over time. Right now, we buy everything cash on the barrelhead. And there are some very good reasons to do that. But when you have lots of legacy systems needing recapitalization at the same time, it's very hard to see how that works. General Barno, I wanted to give you a chance in terms of what you've heard here today from the other witnesses, anything you'd want to respond to, something you feel strongly about or want the committee to know?
Yeah, absolutely, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to start with some of Michael's points, but to your last point as well in terms of recapitalization of legacy systems, one of the things that I worry about as I look at how we're planning to invest some of these dollars in systems is that we're building for yesterday instead of tomorrow. You know, the tanker fleet might be an example to think about. Are we building a tanker fleet that's going to be predicated on having 2,400 F-35s, very short-range manned strike fighters that I have to continue to refuel to get them to the target area, as opposed to investing differently and putting a deeper investment now in unmanned, long-range stealthy strike assets that could fly off of carriers or fly off of land bases that might not require the size of that tanker fleet. So we're a bit of a cross point now in terms of what technology, particularly I think in the unmanned submersible and unmanned air systems, is giving us. And yet we're still looking through the lens of yesterday in a sense as how we buy what might be the last manned aircraft out there. That's, you know, to Mike's point on the F-35 specifically, I would agree. I think that taking about a 50% cut in the total number of F-35s, ballpark, is an acceptable risk if you then invest in accelerating your development and your fielding of unmanned strike platforms, and then perhaps filling in some of those gaps with fourth-generation fighters. So how you decide that mix is extraordinarily important. And I'm concerned in some ways that we're building the best biplane in 1936 because we can't see that 10 years later we're going to have the skies dominated by jet fighters. I see that in shipbuilding to some extent, and I certainly see that in some of our manned air platforms. So to Michael's points across all those, I'd say ground forces, I think we can go lower. I'm not sure we want to go much deeper than the 1990s levels. That would be about 482,000 in the Army and about 175,000 in the Marines. I absolutely endorse the idea of crew rotations in the Navy for smaller vessels. Can't do that with an aircraft carrier, but you can certainly do that with DDGs, destroyers, and things of that nature. Nuclear forces, I think there's room for maneuver there, you know, within New START, and there's places for some significant savings in that arena while maintaining a robust nuclear deterrent. And then finally, in littoral combat ship, I also agree with that. I think that ship was built for a different era. It was built for a belief we're going to be in the littorals where the threat would be different. And there's been a number of questions raised by the test community, some of which have been documented by the Congressional Research Service on the survivability of the LCS. So whether we need to buy as many as we originally thought versus making some other trade-offs, perhaps investing, in my view, and I think Mike wrote this as well, James has written about it, in the national security cutter in the Coast Guard performs a lot of those kind of missions, frigate-like missions, that the Navy doesn't buy because it's a Coast Guard vessel. Well, from a platform standpoint, it looks very good as a fit against that niche in the Navy. So we might be able to do some innovative thinking across two different departments of the government there. So those are just some quick thoughts from me.
All right.